The cavernous hall of the National Air and Space Museum was a cathedral dedicated to human ambition, its vaulted ceilings cradling titans of aviation history, the spirit of St. Louis. The Apollo 11 command module, the Bell X-1. Tonight, however, the silent giants were merely the backdrop for the living legends of the industry. The annual Aviation Innovation Gala was the apex of the aerospace social calendar, a glittering affair where reputations were forged and fortunes were charted in hushed conversations over champagne and canapés. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered prestige, hummed with the low thrum of power. Julian Sinclair stood near the entrance of the main gallery, a point of calm stillness in the swirling currents of tuxedos and couture gowns. He was to be the night's main honoree, the recipient of the Vanguard Award for his work as the founder and CEO of Helios Innovations. His company's proprietary AI, the Helios Matrix, had revolutionized predictive analytics in the energy sector and was now poised to do the same for aviation, promising to predict catastrophic mechanical failures with unprecedented accuracy. At 42, he possessed a quiet, self-assured presence that power brokers twice his age found both intriguing and unnerving. He was a disruptor, an outsider who had built his empire on logic and code, far from the legacy-driven world of old aviation money. He was exchanging pleasantries with a senator from Washington State when a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere caught his attention. A path was clearing through the crowd, a silent parting of the waters that preceded the arrival of true royalty. Through the gap came a woman who seemed to absorb all the light in the room, reflecting it back as a cold, polished sheen. Caroline Harrington, the new chairwoman of Astrius Aviation Group, moved with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never been told no. Her silver gown was a column of liquid mercury, her blonde hair sculpted into a severe, elegant chignon. She had inherited Astrius 6 months ago upon the death of her reclusive, legendary father, Alistair Harrington, and had immediately begun a ruthless, top-down restructuring of the global airline. She was the talk of the industry, a beautiful, enigmatic shark in a pond of aging whales. Her eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, found Julian and locked onto him. She changed course, her entourage of sycophants trailing in her wake, and moved directly toward him. The senator, recognizing a superior power, offered a mumbled excuse and melted back into the crowd. "Mr. Sinclair," Caroline said, her voice smooth and low, yet carrying over the ambient chatter. She extended a hand, her grip brief and cool. "Caroline Harrington. A pleasure." "Ms. Harrington," Julian replied, his voice a warm, steady baritone. "The pleasure is mine. My condolences on the loss of your father. He was a true giant." A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. "Thank you. My father was formidable. He believed in building things that last." She paused, her eyes sweeping over him in a slow, deliberate appraisal. "Helios Innovations. Very impressive. Predictive analytics. It's the future. They say." "We believe so," Julian said, maintaining a polite, neutral smile. "The goal is to make the future safer." "Safer," she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. Her smile was a perfect, bloodless curve, a work of art that conveyed no warmth. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was intended for him alone, yet was just loud enough for those nearby to sense the shift in tone. "It's so brave of you to accept an award for innovation, Mr. Sinclair, especially an award for making things safer." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her gaze unwavering. "Considering how past innovations in your family have ended so disastrously." The words were a stiletto, slipped between his ribs with surgical precision. The air left Julian's lungs. The noise of the gala faded into a distant roar. For a split second, he was no longer in a museum hall. He was a 10-year-old boy standing in a field of wreckage, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth and aviation fuel. He saw the twisted metal of a single-engine experimental aircraft, a revolutionary design meant to be the safest light aircraft ever built. His father's design. The public humiliation was breathtaking in its cruelty. It was a deeply personal attack, a reference to a tragedy 30 years old, a wound he thought had long since scarred over. Only a handful of industry old-timers would understand the reference. But Caroline Harrington had deployed it with the devastating impact of a targeted munition. She was telling him, in the coded language of their world, "I know who you are. I know your family's shame. You do not belong here." He felt the eyes of those around them, the curious glances, the sudden halt in nearby conversations. They didn't know the specifics, but they knew a blow had been landed. They were waiting for his reaction, for outrage, for a denial, for a crack in his composure. Julian did none of those things. He held her gaze, his own eyes, dark and deep, revealing nothing. He took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself against the phantom tremor of the past. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Safety is a lesson some of us have to learn the hard way. Ms. Harrington," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Let's hope, for the sake of your passengers, that you never have to—" He turned away from her then, leaving her standing in the small circle of silence she had created. He calmly accepted a glass of water from a passing server and rejoined a conversation as if nothing had happened. But inside, the ghost of a 10-year-old boy was screaming. Caroline Harrington had not just insulted him. She had declared war. And Julian Sinclair, a man who had built his life on predicting and neutralizing threats, now had a new, very specific threat to analyze. The Sinclair name, once synonymous with pioneering spirit in aeronautics, was now a footnote in aviation history, forever linked to a single, catastrophic event. Julian's father, Dr. Marcus Sinclair, had been a brilliant, obsessive aeronautical engineer. He was a visionary who saw flaws in conventional aircraft design and believed he could build something better, safer, more efficient. His creation was the Starfire, a sleek, single-engine aircraft built from a revolutionary carbon composite, with a canard wing design and a ballistic parachute system designed to save the entire plane in case of engine failure. It was his life's work, funded by his own savings and a handful of small investors. The day of the final test flight was seared into Julian's memory. It had been a bright, cloudless Saturday. His father, radiating a proud, nervous energy, had kissed him goodbye at the small airfield. In the passenger seat was his father's primary investor and close friend, a man named Thomas Harrington, Alistair Harrington's younger, more adventurous brother. Caroline, a girl of about 15, had been there too, standing beside her stoic father, watching her uncle prepare for the flight. The Starfire took off beautifully. It soared, a testament to Marcus Sinclair's genius. Then, on its final approach, something went wrong. A sickening, metallic crack echoed across the field. The canard wing seemed to fold, and the plane entered an uncontrollable dive. The ballistic parachute never deployed. The impact was a percussive, final thud, followed by a plume of black smoke. Marcus Sinclair and Thomas Harrington were killed instantly. The NTSB investigation that followed was a public crucifixion. The media, fueled by whispers from Alistair Harrington's powerful PR machine, portrayed Marcus as a reckless amateur, a backyard tinkerer whose ambition had outstripped his talent. The official report cited catastrophic structural failure due to a flawed wing design. The Sinclair name was ruined. Julian and his mother were left with nothing but debt and shame. But Julian remembered his father's meticulousness. The endless nights spent triple-checking calculations. The unwavering confidence in his own work. The official story had never felt right. The memory of that day. And the cold, accusing stare Alistair Harrington had given him. A 10-year-old boy had been the silent, driving engine of Julian's life. He had turned away from the sky and toward the clean, irrefutable world of data. He had built Helios Innovations, not just to succeed, but to prove, in a different arena, that the Sinclair name could stand for safety and precision. He had built a fortress of logic to protect himself from the chaotic, emotional wreckage of the past. Now, Caroline Harrington had breached those walls. Her attack at the gala was a clear signal the old vendetta, the one her father had nurtured in silence for 3 decades, was now hers. Her recent takeover of Astrius after Alistair's death wasn't just a change in leadership. It was the ascension of a new monarch with an old score to settle. Back in his penthouse apartment overlooking Chicago, the Vanguard Award sitting unheeded on his desk, Julian convened a late-night video call with his chief risk officer and most trusted confidant, Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris was a whirlwind of punk rock energy and MIT-level genius. Her sharp, analytical mind hidden behind a playful exterior of brightly colored hair and band t-shirts. "So, the Ice Queen of Astrius has a thing for family history," Eris said after Julian recounted the encounter. "Charming. What's your play?" "My play is to understand the opponent," Julian said, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Alistair Harrington hated my father. He made sure the world knew it. But Caroline, this was different. It wasn't old grief. It was active, personal malice. She wanted to hurt me." "Mission accomplished, by the sound of it," Eris noted, her tone softening with concern. "It was a reminder," Julian corrected. "A reminder of what happens when you trust in faulty assumptions. The world assumed my father was reckless. I want to know what assumptions Caroline Harrington is running her airline on." He stopped pacing. "Eris, I want you to put a team on Astrius. A full-spectrum analysis. Finances, operations, supply chain, personnel changes since she took over. Use the matrix. I want to know everything. For now. It's just for our own situational awareness. Let's see what's under the hood of her shiny new toy." "On it," Eris said, her fingers already flying across a keyboard. "Consider the Ice Queen's castle under surveillance." Julian ended the call and stood looking out at the city lights. He had spent his life building a system that could predict failure in complex machines. Now, he was pointing it at a complex human being. Caroline Harrington had made this personal. She had resurrected the ghost of his father, and in doing so, she had awoken something in Julian, a cold, patient, analytical anger that would not rest until it had deconstructed her world, piece by piece. The following week, the conflict moved from the ballroom to the boardroom, albeit one at 35,000 feet. Julian was scheduled to fly to London for a Helios expansion meeting. His executive assistant had, as always, booked him on Astrius Airlines Flight 815 in his preferred seat. 2A. Helios had a multi-million-dollar corporate account with the airline, a legacy arrangement from before Caroline's tenure. As he settled into his seat, he felt a strange sense of premonition. The encounter at the gala had been too deliberate. It was a warning shot. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was not over. He was proven right minutes before the cabin door was scheduled to close. Caroline Harrington, dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored navy suit, strode into the first-class cabin. She didn't even glance at the other passengers. Her eyes went directly to him. She stopped at his seat, a flight attendant trailing nervously behind her. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "It seems we have a small issue." "Ms. Harrington," Julian replied, his tone level. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "The pleasure of my company is reserved for those who respect this airline's protocols," she said coolly. She turned to the flight attendant. "I believe there has been a mistake. This is my seat." The flight attendant, a young woman named Maria, looked flustered. "Ma'am, our records show this seat is assigned to Mr. Sinclair. Perhaps your boarding pass." "My boarding pass is irrelevant," Caroline cut in. "I am the chairwoman of this airline. I always sit in 2A. It's an established understanding. I'm sure the airline has a protocol for seating its newer clients. Perhaps you could remind him of it." The subtext was a sledgehammer. Newer clients. Remind him. She was using the coded language of class and race to frame him as an interloper who didn't understand the unwritten rules of her world. Julian saw the game immediately. This wasn't a random seating dispute. It was a staged power play, a public dominance ritual designed to humiliate him in front of a cabin full of his peers. The other first-class passengers, bankers, executives, a well-known actress were now watching. Their curiosity piqued. Julian didn't rise to the bait. He didn't get angry. He met her veiled aggression with calm, relentless logic. "Ms. Harrington," he began, his voice quiet but carrying. "My ticket, which was purchased through my company's corporate account with your airline, designates this seat for me. Are you suggesting that your internal understandings supersede a legally binding contract of carriage?" Caroline's perfect smile tightened. He had refused to play the role of the flustered victim. He was using the language of contracts and legality, her own world's weapons, against her. "I'm suggesting," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "that you are causing a disruption. The courteous thing to do would be to accept an alternate seat. And the professional thing to do, as the head of this company, would be to address what appears to be a flaw in your booking system, rather than berating a paying customer in front of his fellow passengers." Julian countered smoothly. He gestured to the empty seat across the aisle. 2B. That seat appears to be available. It offers an identical level of service. Why is this specific seat so important? He had cornered her by asking a simple, logical question. He had exposed the irrationality of her demand. It wasn't about the seat. It was about making him move, making him submit. She had no logical answer, so she resorted to raw power. Her face hardened, the mask of polite society falling away to reveal the cold fury beneath. "I don't need to explain myself to you." She turned to the now panicked Maria. "This man is being belligerent. If he does not move, have the captain remove him from my aircraft." My aircraft. The two words hung in the air. An absolute declaration of ownership. The situation had escalated. The purser and the first officer were now on the scene, drawn by the commotion. Julian knew he had a choice. He could stand his ground, force a confrontation that would delay the flight and likely end with him being forcibly removed. He would be legally in the right, but he would have handed her the scene she craved, the image of the angry black man being escorted off a plane. Or he could fold, but on his own terms. He chose the latter. He slowly gathered his tablet and jacket, stood up, and faced the assembled crew. He didn't look at Caroline. He looked at Maria, whose face was pale with fear. "It is clear," Julian said, his voice calm and clear for the entire cabin to hear, "that Ms. Harrington's personal comfort is the top operational priority for Astrius Airlines. I would hate for my presence in this specific seat to jeopardize the flight crew's careers or delay the other passengers. He then looked directly at Caroline, his eyes cold and analytical. You've made your point. Ms. Harrington, enjoy your seat. He moved to 4A, the alternate seat they had offered. He settled in, opened his laptop, and began to work, projecting an aura of complete indifference. But inside, the Helios matrix in his mind was running a new calculation. Caroline Harrington was not just arrogant and prejudiced. She was dangerously impulsive, willing to disrupt the operations of her own company and alienate a major corporate client to satisfy a personal whim. A leader who behaved this way in public was likely making far more reckless decisions in private. As the plane took off, he sent a one-line encrypted message to Eris Thorne. Upgrade Astrius analysis to red level. I have reason to believe the operational rot is systemic and begins at the very top. The battle for Seat 2A was over. Caroline had won the territory, but in doing so, she had given Julian all the data he needed to win the war. Julian's decision to pull Helios Innovations' multi-million-dollar corporate account from Astrius was executed with quiet, surgical precision. There was no press release, no angry phone call, just a formal, legally airtight letter from Helios's counsel citing a strategic realignment of corporate travel policies. The move was a significant financial blow, but more importantly, it was a vote of no confidence from a major player in the tech world. It was a signal, and within the cloistered circles of corporate America, signals were everything. Caroline Harrington received the news in her sterile, white office atop Astrius Tower. Her initial reaction was a flash of triumphant rage. Good, she thought. Let him run. Her right-hand man, the perpetually smiling and utterly ruthless corporate lawyer, Arthur Sterling, affirmed her view. It's a minor loss, Caroline, Sterling said, his voice a soothing balm of calculated reassurance. Sinclair is acting on emotion, a petulant response to being put in his place. We're in the middle of Project Ascension. We're trimming the fat, streamlining. A demanding client like Helios, with their endless specific requests, is exactly the kind of fat we need to trim. Project Ascension was Caroline and Sterling's master plan. It was a brutal, top-to-bottom cost-cutting initiative designed to boost Astrius's stock price in the short term, proving to the board and to the ghost of her father that she was a decisive, bottom-line focused leader. The plan involved renegotiating union contracts, cutting employee benefits, and, most critically, overhauling the airline's maintenance and supply chain. This was where Julian had instructed Eris to focus the Helios matrix's analytical power, and what she found was deeply alarming. Eris, operating from a secure data center that was the nerve center of Helios, bypassed corporate firewalls and tapped into a network of industry informants. She painted a grim picture for Julian. They've terminated their long-term contracts with Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce for certified replacement parts, Eris reported, her face on Julian's screen framed by lines of scrolling code. They're now sourcing from a third-party supplier called Global Aero Components. GAC is cheap, dirt cheap. They specialize in reverse engineering and manufacturing aftermarket parts that meet the bare minimum FAA certification standards. On paper, it's legal. In reality, it's like replacing the Swiss movement in a Rolex with a cheap knockoff. It'll tick, but you don't want to be relying on it in a high-pressure situation. The first major obstacle to Project Ascension came from within Astrius itself. Robert Chen, the airline's chief of engineering for over 30 years, was a man who had practically been raised by Alistair Harrington. He was a relic of the old guard, a man who believed an airline's soul resided in its maintenance hangars. When he saw the first shipment of actuator pins from Global Aero Components, he was horrified. He ran a metallurgical analysis and found that while they were FAA certified, they had a significantly lower tolerance for metal fatigue than the original manufacturer's parts. He requested an emergency meeting with Caroline and the board. In the vast, wood-paneled silence of the Astrius boardroom, Chen, a man of quiet dignity, laid out his case. "Ms. Harrington," he began, his voice steady despite the intimidating setting. "These parts are a liability. We're talking about components for the hydraulic systems, the control surfaces, in the 787s. These systems are under immense and constant stress. These GAC parts might last for their certified cycle, but they have no margin for error. An unexpected stress event, severe turbulence, a hard landing could lead to catastrophic failure. Alistair would have never allowed a component like this on one of his planes." The mention of her father's name caused Caroline to stiffen. She saw Chen not as a loyal servant trying to protect the company, but as another part of the old world telling her what she couldn't do, judging her by her father's standards. Arthur Sterling stepped in before she could speak. "Robert, your loyalty is admirable, but your engineering perspective is dated. Our competitors have been using cost-effective sourcing for years. Global Aero Components is a respected supplier. Your analysis is based on fear, not fact. We have the FAA's stamp of approval. That is the only approval that matters. The FAA certifies minimums." "Arthur, not optimums," Chen retorted, his voice rising with passion. "Astrius has always been about the optimum. It's what our reputation is built on." Caroline finally spoke, her voice as cold as the Chicago wind rattling the windows. "Mr. Chen, your concerns are noted and dismissed. Project Ascension is moving forward. If you are unable to align with the new strategic direction of this company, perhaps it's time for you to consider the generous early retirement package we are offering veteran employees." It was a threat, delivered with a polite smile. The message was clear: get in line or get out. 2 weeks later, Robert Chen, the keeper of Astrius's institutional memory and its most passionate safety advocate, was gone. The departure of Chen sent a chilling message through the ranks. A culture of fear began to permeate the airline. Pilots who reported minor but persistent mechanical issues were told by management to stop papering the system with minor write-ups that caused delays. Captain Ava Rosta, a senior 787 pilot, filed 3 separate reports about a spongy or delayed response from the rudder controls during high-altitude flights. Her reports were logged and then buried under a mountain of paperwork. While the internal culture at Astrius was souring, Julian's team at Helios was building a terrifyingly accurate predictive model. They fed every piece of available data into the Helios matrix, Astrius's new maintenance schedules, GAC's manufacturing batch records, flight data from publicly available sources, and even atmospheric turbulence models. The AI began to connect the dots, finding patterns invisible to the human eye. Eris called Julian with a grave look on her face. She pulled up a 3D model of a Boeing 787 on his screen. Certain components around the tail assembly were glowing, shifting from green to yellow, and now, on a handful of specific aircraft, to a pulsing, ominous red. The matrix is flagging a critical failure probability in the rudder actuator assemblies of 12 specific 787s in the Astrius fleet. She said, "It's the GAC pins. The model predicts that under a specific combination of flight hours, pressurization cycles, and acute aerodynamic stress, there is a 94.6% probability of component shear, the pin snapping in half. If that happens in the air, the pilot loses primary rudder control. The plane could go into an uncontrollable spin." A cold dread washed over Julian. This was no longer a business rivalry or a personal vendetta. He was sitting on data that predicted a potential mass casualty event. He was now faced with a profound moral dilemma. He couldn't go to the FAA. His data was proprietary, derived from unconventional sources. They would dismiss it as corporate espionage from a competitor with a grudge. He couldn't go to the press for the same reason. Caroline and Sterling would paint him as a disgruntled ex-client, trying to manipulate their stock price. He was trapped in a Cassandra-like nightmare. He could see the future. But no one would believe him. "What can we do?" Julian asked. His voice strained. "We can watch," Eris said grimly. "We've flagged the tail numbers of the high-risk aircraft. The Matrix will monitor their flight paths, cross-referencing real-time weather data. It will alert us if one of them enters a high-risk scenario. But Julian, we're just watching the clock tick down on a bomb, and we have no way to defuse it." Julian stared at the pulsing red lights on the screen. Each one represented a plane filled with hundreds of unsuspecting people, their lives hanging on a cheap piece of metal. A component approved by a woman who was more concerned with winning a petty feud than listening to her own experts. The weight of his knowledge was crushing. All he could do was wait for the whisper of a problem to become a scream that the whole world could hear. The scream came on a clear Tuesday afternoon over the skies of Texas. Astrius Flight 212, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner with the tail number N783AS, was one of the 12 aircraft flagged in the Helios Matrix's highest probability warning. Julian's team had been monitoring it for 3 weeks. The plane, en route from Boston to Dallas-Fort Worth, was filled with 242 passengers and a crew of 10. As Captain Ben Carter began the final descent, the Helios Matrix, thousands of miles away in Chicago, flashed a critical alert. The crosswinds at DFW were gusting more than predicted, creating the exact kind of lateral shear stress on the vertical stabilizer that the AI had modeled as a potential trigger. Eris Thorne and her team watched their screens in helpless horror. In the cockpit of Flight 212, everything was routine. Captain Carter, a pilot with 20,000 hours of flight time, made a minor correction with the rudder pedals to align the aircraft with the runway. That's when it happened. A loud, percussive bang echoed from the rear of the aircraft. So powerful, it felt like a physical blow. The plane instantly and violently yawed to the left, throwing the pilots against their harnesses. A cacophony of alarms shrieked through the cockpit. On the main display, a single, terrifying message flashed in red rudder control failure. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" the first officer yelled into the radio. "Astrius 212 has a flight control emergency. We have a full rudder hardover." The GAC actuator pin had snapped. The rudder was jammed, locked in a fully deflected position, acting like a giant air brake on one side of the tail. The 787, a marvel of modern engineering, was being forced into a spiraling, uncontrolled descent. Chaos erupted in the cabin. Luggage flew from overhead bins. Passengers screamed as they were thrown against their seats. What followed was a feat of almost superhuman airmanship. Captain Carter fought against the plane's suicidal trajectory, using asymmetrical engine thrust, powering up the right engine, and idling the left to counteract the violent yaw. It was a desperate, brutal battle of man and machine against a single, catastrophic point of failure. He managed to arrest the spiral, but the plane was still barely controllable, coming in far too fast and at a dangerous angle. He aimed for the runway, knowing they wouldn't make it cleanly. Flight 212 slammed onto the tarmac, bounced once, and then veered off the runway, skidding sideways through the grass. The landing gear collapsed, and the left wing dug into the earth, spinning the plane in a gut-wrenching arc before it finally shuddered to a stop. Its fuselage cracked and twisted. Silence. Then, the blessedly swift arrival of airport fire and rescue crews, spraying foam on the smoking engines. Miraculously, due to Captain Carter's skill and a healthy dose of luck. There were no fatalities. Dozens were injured, some seriously, but everyone had survived. The media storm was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The miracle at DFW was the lead story on every news channel in the world. For Julian Sinclair, it was a moment of grim, sickening validation. The public event he needed to justify his actions had arrived, but at a terrifying cost. The clock was no longer ticking. It had run out. For Caroline Harrington, the news was an apocalypse. She watched the footage of the broken plane on the massive screen in her office. Her face, a mask of disbelief. Arthur Sterling was at her side, his usual composure shattered, frantically spinning scenarios. A bird strike. It has to be a bird strike. Or a freak weather event. We control the narrative. But the narrative was already out of their hands. The NTSB and the FAA descended upon the wreckage. They weren't interested in corporate spin. They were interested in forensic truth. Within 48 hours, they found the sheared actuator pin. Within 72, they had traced its origin to Global Aero Components and cross-referenced it with Astrius's recent maintenance records. The FAA acted with swift and decisive fury. They issued an emergency airworthiness directive, grounding Astrius's entire fleet of 787s. The stock price didn't just fall, it ceased to exist, locked in a trading halt as it plummeted 60, then 70% in after-hours trading. The stories of Robert Chen's forced retirement and Captain Rasta's ignored warnings were leaked to the press by angry employees. The miracle at DFW had a new name in the headlines: the Astrius fiasco. The final blow came directly from the FAA Administrator's office in Washington. Astrius Airlines was given a 72-hour ultimatum, present a complete, verifiable plan to identify and replace every single suspect part across their entire fleet, and prove that their safety culture was fundamentally repaired. Or the FAA would begin proceedings to permanently revoke their operating certificate. Caroline's world had completely collapsed. The empire she had inherited was turning to dust in her hands. She was trapped in her tower. A pariah. The face of a disaster. In a desperate, late-night emergency meeting, her remaining executives confirmed the impossibility of the FAA's demand. They had no way to track which of the tens of thousands of GAC parts had gone into which planes. It was a logistical nightmare with no solution. It was a junior data analyst who finally spoke up, her voice trembling. There's one company, Helios Innovations. Their AI, the Helios Matrix. They specialize in this kind of predictive analysis. They could find the pattern. They're the only ones. The name landed in the room like a grenade. Julian Sinclair. Caroline felt the blood drain from her face. The cosmic, crushing irony of it was almost too much to bear. The man she had publicly humiliated. The man whose family she had scorned. The man she had tried to eject from her world. Was now the only person in existence who could save it. Her assistant, his face pale, managed to get a message through to Julian's office. The reply came back an hour later. It was not a negotiation. It was a summons. Mr. Sinclair will grant Ms. Harrington an audience. Tomorrow morning, 8:00 a.m. sharp, at Helios headquarters. She is to come alone. Stripped of her power, her pride, and her defenses, Caroline Harrington had no choice. She was no longer a queen demanding her seat. She was a supplicant, forced to journey into the heart of her enemy's territory, to beg for salvation. The emergency hearing convened by the Federal Aviation Administration was held in a cavernous, impersonal auditorium in Washington, D.C. The air was thick with tension and the sterile scent of institutional power. Banks of television cameras lined the back wall. their red lights blinking like malevolent eyes, broadcasting the proceedings live to a nation that was now terrified of flying Astrius Airlines. At a long table sat the FAA's senior administrators, a panel of stern-faced inquisitors led by Administrator Elena Peterson. At a smaller table in the center sat Caroline Harrington, flanked by a new set of lawyers. She looked small and fragile in the vast room, her tailored suit like armor that no longer fit. Arthur Sterling was conspicuously absent, having already resigned and lawyered up to save himself. Caroline's presentation was a disaster. She read from a prepared statement, filled with corporate jargon about reaffirming commitments and robust internal reviews. She was evasive, defensive, and completely out of her depth. The panel dismantled her testimony with cold, precise questions about maintenance logs, whistleblower reports, and command responsibility. She had no credible answers. The fate of her airline was being sealed with every fumbled response. "Ms. Harrington," Administrator Peterson said, her voice cutting through the room, "you have presented us with apologies and promises. You have not presented us with a viable plan to make your fleet safe. The 72-hour deadline has passed. Do you have anything further?" Before Caroline could answer, one of the FAA's lawyers spoke up. "Administrator, we would like to call one final witness. He has come forward with new, relevant data. We call Mr. Julian Sinclair, CEO of Helios Innovations." A murmur swept through the auditorium. Julian Sinclair, the brilliant tech CEO, the man whose company had just severed ties with Astrius. What was he doing here? Julian entered from a side door and walked to the witness table with a calm, deliberate stride. He carried nothing but a small tablet. He was sworn in, his voice steady and clear. "Mr. Sinclair," the FAA counsel began, "we understand you have developed an analytical tool that may shed some light on the systemic failures at Astrius. Is that correct?" "It is," Julian replied. "We call it the Helios Matrix. My team has been conducting a risk analysis of Astrius's operations for the past several weeks." "And what did you find?" "We found a catastrophe in the making," Julian said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. On the massive screens behind the panel, a complex 3D model of the Astrius 787 fleet appeared. We ingested every piece of data we could find: maintenance schedules, flight records, supply chain manifests, even the metallurgical batch data from your new supplier, Global Aero Components. He walked the panel through the data, his explanations clear, direct, and devastating. He showed how Project Ascension's cost-cutting measures directly correlated with a spike in mechanical discrepancies. He highlighted Captain Rasta's ignored reports. The screens lit up with charts and graphs, a visual symphony of negligence. The Matrix didn't just identify a general risk. Julian continued. It identified the specific parts, from specific manufacturing batches, that were flawed, and it predicted which individual aircraft were most likely to fail. He brought up a new screen. It was a list of 12 tail numbers. At the top of the list, glowing in bright red, was N783AS, the plane that had crashed in Dallas. A collective gasp went through the room. It was irrefutable, a smoking gun forged from pure data. He had predicted the disaster. With this data, Julian concluded, we can generate a precise, actionable list of every aircraft that requires immediate inspection and retrofitting. We can tell you exactly which needles to find in your haystack. It is a plan that can be implemented within days, not months. He had handed the FAA a lifeline. He had saved Astrius Airlines from immediate extinction. Caroline stared at him, a complex mixture of awe, shame, and a flicker of desperate hope on her face. He had the power to save her. But Julian wasn't finished. However, he said, his voice dropping, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. The Helios matrix does more than analyze recent data. It can also analyze the past. To understand the root cause of this failure in safety culture, I believe we need to look at the history of the Harrington family's relationship with innovation. His eyes locked with Caroline's across the room. A cold dread, colder than anything she had felt before, seized her. 32 years ago, Julian said, and a new image appeared on the screens. It was a grainy photograph of a sleek, futuristic-looking single-engine plane. The Starfire. My father, Dr. Marcus Sinclair, designed this aircraft. It crashed on a test flight, killing him and his passenger, Mr. Thomas Harrington. The room was utterly silent. The official NTSB report, a report heavily influenced by Alistair Harrington's testimony, blamed a flawed wing design. My father was branded as reckless. His name was ruined. This event, I believe, has cast a long shadow. It seems to have created a culture within the Harrington family that is deeply suspicious of innovation and deeply committed to a narrative of blame. He looked directly at Caroline, his voice softening with something that sounded almost like pity. Your entire life, Ms. Harrington, you have believed this story, that my family's ambition was responsible for your family's tragedy. Your actions toward me, from the gala to the flight to London, have been colored by that belief. It has fueled a vendetta based on a 30-year-old lie. He paused, then swiped his tablet. A new document appeared on the screens. It was yellowed with age, stamped with the official seal of the National Transportation Safety Board. This, Julian said, his voice ringing with the clear, undeniable force of truth, is the original NTSB preliminary field report, the one that was quietly buried and replaced by the final version. My team uncovered it in a deep archive. It tells a very different story. He zoomed in on a specific paragraph. The field investigators found the primary cause of the structural failure was not the wing design. It was a faulty aileron hinge bolt. It had sheared in half due to a metallurgical flaw. He swiped again, bringing up an old shipping manifest. That bolt was supplied to my father by a company called Harrington Machine Works, a small component supplier, a supplier owned and operated by Alistair Harrington himself. The room exploded. The secondary twist was a bombshell that reshaped everything. Alistair Harrington hadn't just blamed an innocent man. He had framed him to cover up his own company's fatal error. He had allowed his brother to fly in a plane with a faulty part from his own factory, and then had spent the rest of his life, and his daughter's life, enforcing the lie that saved his reputation. Caroline Harrington made a small, wounded sound, like a cry of physical pain. Her life's motivating animus, her righteous anger, the entire foundation of her identity, had just been revealed as a fraud, a cruel deception perpetrated by her own father. Her vendetta was not just misdirected, it was a lie from its very inception. Julian had done more than save the airline. He had dismantled her entire reality, not with anger or revenge, but with cold, irrefutable, and tragic truth. He hadn't just come to the hearing to win. He had come to set the record straight, for his father, for himself, and, in a strange and devastating way, for her. The public spectacle was complete. The karmic debt had been paid in full. In the aftermath of the hearing, the world of Astrius Airlines was remade. Caroline Harrington was stripped of all executive power by the board, which, under the guidance of the FAA, gratefully accepted Julian Sinclair's offer to have Helios Innovations take over operational control in exchange for a controlling stake in the company. Arthur Sterling and his cronies were buried under an avalanche of federal investigations and shareholder lawsuits. The day after the hearing, Julian found Caroline sitting alone in the vast, silent Astrius boardroom, packing a small box of personal items from her father's old office. She looked hollowed out, the fire in her eyes replaced by a deep, desolate sadness. They didn't speak of the hearing or the airline. They spoke of the past. "All those years," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "My father. He let me hate your family. He encouraged it. It was our special bond, our shared tragedy. And it was all a lie." "He was protecting himself," Julian said, his voice gentle. "He was a proud man who made a terrible mistake. The lie was easier than the truth." "He destroyed your father," she said, tears finally tracing paths down her face. "And he poisoned me. He turned my grief into a weapon." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a shame so profound it was difficult to witness. "The things I said to you, the way I treated you, there are no words to apologize for that. It came from a place so dark and so false." "I know," Julian said. It was all that needed to be said. There was no easy forgiveness, but there was, in that quiet room, a shared understanding. They were both survivors of the same wreckage, casualties of Alistair Harrington's lie. In the months that followed, Astrius, under the steady, data-driven leadership of Julian and his team, began its slow, arduous climb back to respectability. The faulty parts were replaced, the safety culture was rebuilt from the ground up, and trust was painstakingly restored. 6 months after the hearing, Caroline Harrington appeared in public for the first time. She stood at a podium, not in a power suit, but in a simple dress, looking poised and serene. She announced the formation of a new, $100 million charitable foundation. "This foundation," she announced, her voice clear and strong, "will be dedicated to advancing aviation safety through engineering scholarships and to providing support for families affected by air tragedies, in honor of the 2 men who lost their lives 32 years ago, and in the spirit of reconciliation and a commitment to truth. It will be called the Harrington Sinclair Aviation Safety Foundation." It was a stunning act of public atonement, a final, definitive closing of a painful chapter. 1 year to the day after the Dallas incident, Julian Sinclair stood in a newly redesigned and expanded engineering hub at Astrius headquarters. The space was bright, open, and filled with young, diverse engineers, a stark contrast to the stuffy boardroom of the past. Robert Chen stood at his side, having been brought back from retirement to serve as a senior advisor. Julian wasn't there as a conqueror. He was there as a builder. He addressed the assembled team, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "Today," he announced, "we are launching a new partnership between Astrius and the Harrington Sinclair Foundation. We are funding a full scholarship program aimed at bringing the brightest young minds from underprivileged backgrounds into the world of aeronautical engineering. We are not just building safer planes. We are building a better, more inclusive future, a legacy of innovation and integrity." He looked out at the sea of hopeful faces. His journey had begun with a bitter taste of humiliation, a targeted act of revenge fueled by a generational lie. But it had ended here, in a place of creation and renewal. He had faced down the ghosts of the past, not by destroying his enemy, but by forcing a confrontation with the truth. In doing so, he had not only restored his family's name, but had also transformed a legacy of tragedy into a promise for the future. True victory, he now understood, wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding something better from the wreckage.